There we go. Hey, welcome everybody to a new stream of Let's Talk About. Today we're going to be discussing agnosticism with Mr. Steve McRae.
I don't know anything about that topic. I'm gonna have to go read about this. You didn't tell me about this, man.
This is a crash course in agnosticism epistemology.
How are we gonna do with mathematics? Okay, whatever.
Nope, we're not doing mathematics today.
See my product placement? Is that too much?
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, that's the very next thing. Before we get into this, please tell everybody. I don't know how they wouldn't know who you are, but please tell everybody who you are, where they can find you, and a little bit about yourself.
My name's Steve McRae. I'm kind of known colloquially as the A-Holy Pope of Agnosticism. I write an epistemological blog called 3 a.m. Philosophy that get some views and some citations. I get a lot of people that go there for references. I have a couple YouTube channels, including my own, Steve McRae. I have the Great Debate Community. I do multiple shows on philosophy, science, logic, critical thinking, including Caffeine Corner with Cheshire Vic, Over and Under, which is a political show with Chris Attlee, aka Atheist Pastor, and DEFCON 1 Science occasionally with the wonderful, world-famous mathematician Landon Kurt Knoll. And of course, I had the Non Sequitur show, which technically I still own, but somebody else has control of it, who is looking at contempt charges in court for it. In fact, I think you might be wearing something similar.
I've got my everything moves backwards on these screens. So I've got my non sequitur shirt on. It says pine trees don't produce elephants. This is famous from the Kent Hovind shirt.
Pine trees and elephants. Yes. And by the way, if anybody wants to watch the funniest hangout of all time, go to the Great Debate Community channel. I think I have it on my own channel. They clipped it, but watch the story of GCAT, Pine Trees and Elephants. When Arn Ra came on after the G-Man discussion, and he had his cat, all-time funniest hangout on YouTube, bar none. I'm not even exaggerating. Every comment is just laughing their ass off. So can I say ass?
Yeah. Say whatever you want. I've got 45 subs. I'm nowhere near monetized. We can just.
That's 45 people that are going to be offended by the word ass.
Most of them are Christian, which is kind of crazy.
Well, hey, isn't ass in the Bible?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, Jesus rode in Jerusalem on an ass, if I'm not mistaken.
It's a donkey, so I mean, we're just covering evolution, so I mean.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you got for me, JB? You scheduled this, and
I scheduled this.
Right. Yeah. What do you got for me?
Yeah, we're good.
My other show, I'm going to argue with Fuzzron. I forgot about that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead. So this is kind of the I've had mostly Christians on so far. I think the one non-Christian I've had on was Callan came on to talk about some polytheism with me.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to be the second, and I started this off with everybody, so we're just going to keep it going. So Jesus, liar, lunatic, or Lord?
I think
a fourth option. If you
don't think it has to be one of the three. I mean, I think that Jesus probably existed as a man. I'm not a mythicist. I think that our understanding of him probably, came down through multiple different attestations of the biblical events from two different people, and I think he was probably a prophet, a prophet or some kind of rabbi of some kind. And I think that maybe people just kind of took it to an extreme, and stories just kind of perpetuated themselves. But whether he was a lunatic himself or not, I have no idea. So I think none of the above, I would say.
I'm in the same boat. It's just it started off as something I was doing with the Christians, and I just figured I'd keep it going and just carry it on with everybody. So to you, in your opinion, what is agnosticism and why is it atheism?
Right. Well, I have on my blog, I break it down very specifically what agnosticism is. And I think a lot of people will just open up a Google definition and they don't make it anything past that. And the problem with that is when you're talking about a specific word that has a meaning and usage in academia and in philosophy, going to a Google dictionary is not going to help you much. I mean, if you're going to be studying something like biology, you don't use Google dictionary to understand certain words like evolution, speciation, adaptation. So I don't know why think anybody would think it would be any different for philosophical terms. So on my blog, I have a one called Agnosticism 3 Ways. I actually have a video on it as well, and explains the multiple polysemous usages of agnosticism. And the earlier version, the original, which was Thomas Huxley's version, was more of an epistemic normative principle, where it was similar to logical positivism in that it was more of a precursor to the scientific method. It was a normal way of kind of looking at how you approach things, how you evaluate things from a pre-scientific method. So it was an epistemological view. It was a principle that you go by. And then that kind of changed over the years, and it became what is now a psychological state. So it's a psychological state of being agnostic on a proposition, where you do not hold the proposition true and you do not hold the proposition false. And there's also the epistemological proposition, which is the knowability of gods, right? Is God knowable? That's a different proposition. So in the realm of ontology, when you're talking about God existing, right? If the proposition is God exists, we're not asking about if gods are knowable. That's a completely different proposition. So when somebody says, well, agnosticism deals with knowledge, they have a category error, because you're not asking about the knowability of God. You're asking about, does God exist? And in that case, agnosticism is the stance on that question. I don't have a value to assign to the proposition God exists or not. I don't assign it true. I don't assign it false. And it's basically you don't have a position on it.
And
It's
I think
what it's called.
I think this is kind of where it gets tricky, and I think where a lot of the conversations go wrong here is so to you, is agnosticism considered a strictly 50-50 position on it, or
no, absolutely not,
or is it kind of fluid and fluctuate?
Yeah, it has. I really like Dr. Malpass's Use of Reason blog, and he has different views. He breaks it down very well. And one of his views, I think it's view 2, if I'm not mistaken, he has it as a single axial landscape mode, where he explains that you have atheism on one side, theism on one side, and then in the middle there you have agnosticism, and then you have from that 50.5, you have a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left. And if you're in that little range, my camera, if you're in that little range from the whole line, then that would still be considered agnosticism. So if you're 51% towards theism, or 51% towards atheism, you're still an agnostic, because you're not convinced yet that the proposition is true or false. So if you hold the position that you're not convinced that God exists, or you're not convinced that God does not exist, but you might lean slightly one way or another, that's perfectly fine. So it's definitely not. I don't think it's even possible to be exactly 50 on that proposition. You can on others, like the gumball analogy. You could be exactly 50.
Okay. So, and I mean, I guess this is a simple question, because you kind of already led to it. So why do you hold yourself as an agnostic?
That's it is a long question, actually. I personally have looked at all the arguments, or not all, but I've looked at many arguments for and against God. And I think it's kind of funny when atheists ask, well, what are the arguments for atheism? I'm like, you're an atheist, but you don't know any arguments for atheism? There's a ton of them, right? Logical problem, evil; evidential problem, evil; divine hiddenness; divine Linus paradox; moral and ontological arguments against God. I mean, there's a ton of them. And there's also, arguments for God. Obviously, the Kalam argument, which I don't think is very good, but there's Plantinga's modal ontological argument, which I think a lot of people get incorrect. I think, the prime mover argument. But overall, if you take the aggregate of all the arguments, I'm just not convinced either way. I think there's probably a high chance that I should say that there's a good chance that it could be a metaphysical explanation for everything. I do tend to brute fact, but if there's a metaphysical explanation, I don't know what that explanation is of the origin of the universe. And if somebody wants to deem that category as God, I'm okay with that, right? But I'm not convinced that being exists. If there's an intentional being that without the universe, without him existing, the universe would cease to exist, or could not exist, or would not exist. I'm not convinced either way that being exists, but I'm not convinced there's no being like that.
Okay. Yeah. I kind of
it's possible.
Yeah. No. I kind of want your take on this too, because I brought this up in a discussion I did with somebody on their channel about my positions, and where I disagree with Jordan Peterson and a lot of the stuff that he says. I think he said something in one of his conversations with Sam Harris when somebody asked him about Jesus, and I think his response was, "I'll get back to you in 7 years" or something like that, because he wanted to go dive into the topic, full scale.
Yeah.
And somebody kind of made a comment to him about it, about, well, you can't say anything, and he goes, well, yeah. He goes, can you tell me all of your beliefs right now if I were to ask you? And I mean, it's kind of and kind of like with me, like some days I wake up and I'm like, okay, I don't know how I feel about this God position. Some days I wake up and I'm like, yeah, I believe there's not a God out there. And I mean, you've got fluctuating models and all this stuff. And I don't think
change. Beliefs are fluid, right? And I don't think we really choose our beliefs per se. I do tend to what's called dosastic involuntarism, but that doesn't necessitate that all beliefs are involuntary. We have will, we have the ability to choose. But I think you're right. I mean, there are people that might be somewhere in the middle, that one day they kind of tend toward God existing, one day they read something and they go, yeah, that maybe they're more likely the probability that maybe there is a God. They may read something the next day and say, yeah, maybe there's more, probability there's not a God. Yeah, I think that beliefs are fluid, and I think that that's fine. I find it disconcerting when you have people that are so rigid that they say things that I find to be untenable, like it is impossible for there to be a God. Okay, well, that requires a very high burden of proof, right? Because you have to demonstrate there's a logical contradiction that exists in order for that being to not exist in any possible world. And I don't think anybody's ever met that standard, right?
Yeah, it's yeah. So well, I mean, it kind of brings me to part of the discussion that was going on yesterday on Twitter that we were both kind of tagged in. Is my problem is I can say that I am atheistic to pretty much any God that I've heard of. But somebody can always come along and give a new definition of God to where I kind of go, well, yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I hear that a lot, but I don't understand that argument. I hear that a lot, and that's almost like an atheist experience type argument. And it's very poor, to be honest. And let me explain why. Because we're not asking about local gods. When we ask the question, does God exist? We're not asking for a specific deity. We're just asking in general, do you think there's some kind of metaphysical being that exists that is either I mean, I have a stipulative term that I use. You want me to read my stipulative term?
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me see if I can find it real quick. Let's see here. I should have put it in my notepad. Well, I'll just paraphrase it. But basically, it's just a creator being that without his existence, a metaphysical necessity that without his existence, the universe could not or would not exist, or some being that has prescriptive ways of changing the laws of the universe, like Thor, or somebody that can alter reality at will. I think would be constitutive of some type of God, right? But generally speaking, it's kind of an all-powerful or extremely powerful being that exists that the universe is contingent upon. I'm okay with that kind of stipulative definition of God. So we're asking about God. That's kind of what we're asking about, right? We're not asking about individual. Do you believe God, like Thor exists? No. Do you believe that, Vishnu exists? No. But we're asking, do you believe that there is such a being that exists in totality, right? In a global sense? That's the question being asked. That's the great debate question.
So what would you say if somebody posed it as they believed in a being that created the universe and then trickled into non-existence after that?
Well, there's two types of theism, right? There's classical theism and non-classical theism. In classical theism, then that would be called a deist, right? Or deistic God. Right. And that would also be an aesthetic God. God created the universe for beauty, then kind of just walked away. But that would not fall under theism in the classical sense, because theism in that sense is a personalized deity. But in the non-classical sense, which is what the operating, when you're asking the question, does God exist, it generally is operating within the realm of non-classical theism. And so deism, which would be a deity, would fall under theism. It doesn't have to be personalized in a non-classical schema.
Okay. So what do you think are probably some of the best arguments for a deity?
I mean, I do think there's something to be said for, and I hate to say it, but I mean, like a prime mover argument, the first cause. I mean, again, if we're talking about the origin of the universe, there are only a certain amount of explanations possible. There could be some kind of infinite regress, right? That's not illogical. A lot of people think that some kind of infinite regress is logical, and it's not. or there is a brute factum in the matter to be had, which is contingent, which is completely possible, but it's non-explanatory. It doesn't satisfy any principle of sufficient reason. Or there's some kind of metaphysical necessity. And, any of them is possible. And if people want to posit a metaphysical necessity as God, I think there's something to be said for that. Now, again, it doesn't necessitate a God, right? And I think the argument from contingency doesn't demonstrate a God, but it sure shows that there's a possibility that a metaphysical necessity exists for the origin of the universe that put things in motion, an uncaused cause. Now, again, do I think it's a great convincing argument? No. If I did, I think it would be a theist, right? But I think there's more to it than just hand waving a lot of these arguments away by fiat, right?
I think probably the best one that I have, I think probably the one that does it the most for me is the Kalam. And my issue, and I guess you could say the prime mover on it also, but my biggest issue is that dealing with infinities is just such a hard concept to really wrap your brain around. And
cardinalities are rough, man. I do math videos where I explain, infinite summations and infinite sequences, and a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their head around that kind of stuff, right? So we're talking about the age of the universe. We're talking about something that has infinite, at least in one direction. We assume the universe will continue infinitely to some degree until it has some kind of heat death or something. But to try to understand that concept, if the universe has some kind of origin, some kind of beginning, where did it stem from? Where time started somehow. Now, I think asking, what was before the Big Bang is a nonsensical question. However, there are entropic type theories that allow for universes to have existed prior to our own, but they're causally unrelated to each other.
Yeah, it's just, you get to a certain point where it's just such a huge, complex discussion that I just kind of tap out. Some of the smartest people in the world can't even agree on where to go.
The math is hard and the concepts are hard. Yeah. So nobody on YouTube is going to solve these problems. It's just we discuss them, but I don't think there's any great answer to them.
I've had I think two of the great things that I've put on Twitter is and they didn't take off. I didn't get viral from them or anything or get recognition, but it was I don't think that we're going to solve the philosophy of morality in 280 characters.
I'm with you, man. And by the way, it's hard enough explaining just what the ethical theories are, and then people that don't understand the ethical theories try to think that they've solved all the moral questions of humanity. I'm like, it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And the other one was, could you imagine what Socrates and Plato would look like if they saw us trying to have philosophical discussions in 280 characters?
Yeah, they'd be face palming.
These are people that they write books on single concepts, and we try to narrow them down to 3 sentences.
Well, and that's what I like about Twitter, though. Twitter really makes you compact your thoughts, right? And so, how many times, and I'm sure we all done this, when you write something on Twitter and you run out of characters, you have to go back and kind of edit and use abbreviations, and that's fine, because again, it makes you compactify your reasoning to try to get the most amount of information across in the minimum amount of space. And I think it's really amazing we can do that. But at the same time, you're not going to have a treatise on ethical considerations on Twitter. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. So following that up, what would you say are some of the best arguments against a God?
I really do think that divine hiddenness and the evidential problem of evil are really good. Divine hiddenness would be, I am, for example, a non-resistant non-believer, right? If God exists, I would be okay to know that, and God is welcome to reveal himself to me. And that was a discussion we had on Agree to Argue the other day with multiple theists, 3 theists. And they actually appreciated that. Like, well, then, yeah, you should be okay, if you're not actively rejecting God. I'm like, well, I don't think a lot of people actively reject God. They reject the concept of God, but I don't think they would reject God if God revealed himself. But that's the problem with divine hiddenness. Why is God hidden from the non-resistant non-believer? And the other problem is the evidential problem of evil, which deals with why is there so much gratuitous evil in the world? If God created this extant possible world, out of all the possible worlds he could have created, we probably have to think along the lines of this was the actualized world that he wanted, right? It was the best of all possible worlds. Why would he create an inferior world? And if it's the best of all possible worlds, then the amount of evil that's in the world is optimal for his plan, whatever that is. So why is it that one less gratuitous evil, meaning some kind of natural evil, a hurricane, stubbing my toe is often used as an example. If I stub my toe 49 times as opposed to 50, have I learned anything about pain that's any different, right? What is there to be gained by having my toe one additional time? So why is that one more gratuitous evil something that exists, right? And again, we're using evil in a very different sense. We're not using it as like the privatization of good or the absence of good. We're not using it as some kind of harm to from a metaphysical being or something like that, or a assault against somebody ethically. We're using evil in the term of something that has been naturally caused here, but by nature. It's something that has done something harmful, but not with any intent or intentionality. That's how the term is understood.
Yeah, it's I think I heard Cosmic Skeptic used an argument like that doing a debate with Inspiring Philosophy on Capturing Christianity one day, and it was he used it to the Holocaust extent. It was like you have to believe that God thought that 6 million Jews was the best way to go, and that it couldn't have been done with 5 million or 4 million.
Yeah, no, I mean that is working on the premise of the evidential problem of evil. Yes.
That was really one of the first times I had kind of put that way, and I was like, wow, I was like, that's true.
Well, like I said, there's two types of problems of evil. There's the evidential, which is what I just described, and then the logical problem of evil, which is a very strong argument, but it only really applies to a very specific type of deity, and not a lot of theists posit that type of deity. It's a very strict type of omni type of deity, like more of an Anselm type God, where you have the omni properties that are very inflexible. That would have a logical inconsistency with evil existing in the world if some God is omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent, and it doesn't correct the issues on earth about the evil. It doesn't fix the problem, right? If God allows us evil, but he has the ability to do so, the wanting to, because he's all good, and he just doesn't, then there's a problem there. It's a logically inconsistent system where all those propositions cannot be true at once. So that type of God has a major issue, but it's very limited in scope. But it's a very powerful argument for that one type of God.
Yeah. And with divine hiddenness or whatever, I've often said that I'm a non-resistant non-believer a lot. I mean, I'm married to a Christian. Both my kids are being brought up under, Christian household, because that's what I was whenever, I had my kids. And that's part of the reason when I started doing this stuff. I've launched interviews, and that's exactly what I've done. I'm trying to have discussions with people of different belief structures so I can understand exactly where everybody's coming from and exactly what each thing is. So you actually have that understanding, and you're not attacking like straw men and, and the weakest parts of it.
I do. Exactly. Yeah, no, I'm thrilled people are doing more of those things. And I like to see the discussions, and I like to see honest dialogue, because I'm in a lot of groups where there's just not a lot of honest dialogue. I mean, I'm on Facebook groups where I got to admit the people there are beyond intellectually dishonest. And it's actually, I hate to say it, but it's more the atheists that are being intellectually dishonest than the theists I see a lot of times. And that's disconcerting as a non-believer, right? I'm like, I mean, I've had people tell me, like my simple logic is wrong. And then when I asked them, okay, well, what do you know about simple logic? They're like, oh, absolutely nothing. Well, then how are you critiquing my logic if you don't even know what like validity is, right? If you know what valid means in logic, I kind of have to take a step back and go, why are you critiquing a logical argument if you don't know anything about logic? I mean, that seems kind of odd to me, right? And by the way, I'm no expert in logic. I have a very basic understanding of logic. First year college kind of stuff, maybe second, but nothing to any extreme by any stretch of imagination. But I know the basics, the fundamentals, and they're not even at that level. And so it's weird when you as a non-believer, you see other non-believers make these super horrific, critically bad mistakes, and then people that do know the topic will tell them that, no, you're just wrong. And they have this arrogance about them, like this confidently wrong approach to things. And I see it. I know people in your audience, I recognize some names. They've seen it with some atheist people as well. And I think that shuts down the conversation, because why would I want to have a dialogue with somebody that I know off the bat, one, doesn't know anything about the topic, and two, is arrogantly trying to say that like I'm wrong without having the fundamental skill set to do so. It's a little bothering, especially again as a non-believer, because they're in the same camp as me. Not to pull the tribal card, but it's like I don't want to look bad as a non-believer.
I know. I just want to point this out, that you said something in there that it's how YouTube works. Somebody's going to go in and clip you out of context, because you actually just said, I'm no expert in philosophy.
I'm not. That's not out of context. No, I'm fine with that. I have no expertise.
You could guarantee somebody clipping that out.
I've never claimed expertise on any topic on YouTube. Go find any video where I said I was an expert. Never. I'm not. I'm just a halfway decently read on some things layperson. But my whole shtick on YouTube is that as a layperson, I'm able to read something, comprehend it, and explain it to people in a way that hopefully they'll understand. Some things I do have a little more. I have been to college and obviously took some courses. But my thing is, if I could understand it as a layperson, I want other lay people to understand it, because I'm not an expert in the topics. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I was playing with you because I knew somebody was gonna. Oh, Steve admitted he doesn't know philosophy.
Well, I know the basics of philosophy, but again, I'm not an expert in philosophy, and I'm fine to admit that. Absolutely.
You know how it goes, though.
Oh, You've been around long enough. With anything. It's incredible the amount of effort they go to try to personally attack me, rather than any of the things that I've actually put out logically, right? Because again, the people that know logic, I have some detractors that actually do know logic, but even they're like, they don't attack my logical arguments, because they would look foolish if they did.
We've got there. I wanted. Yeah, this is going to be a good topic for us to get into. So, you had a small. I say small. I didn't really keep up with it. Facebook debate with one Dr. Richard Carrier.
I've had a couple. I actually had one full-on written debate with him. Yeah, that's true.
And Carrier, and I'm probably gonna get this wrong, but you probably have a better memory of it than I do. Carrier basically made an argument in the beginning that I think you rejected, that the existence, or something along the lines of, atheism is now the default position, the same way evolution is in biology. And it's a battle against instead of a battle for. He
argued. He has two blog posts on me, actually, but he had argued, and again, I talked to some people on this, and even they were kind of astounded by it. But he had argued that he agreed with me that atheism, in any form, weak or strong, whether you hold to atheism as merely lack of belief or belief that God does not exist, requires a burden of proof. He did agree with me on this. However, his argument was that atheism has de facto, or prima facie, has already met its burden of proof, just like the theory of evolution has met its burden of proof. That's why it's a substantiated theory. There's an equivocation issue there. There's a false equivalence, actually, there. Not equivocation, but there's a false equivalence there, because in science, when you have a consensus on a theory, and a theory is substantiated, a well-substantiated body of evidence that explains natural phenomenon, that is something that has already met its burden of proof. You can't say a philosophical position has met some kind of burden of, prima facie burden of proof. That makes no sense. I mean, because you're dealing with a topic on people's opinions, a subjectivity, right? Because I don't believe there's an objective fact of the matter to be had, or at least we don't have access to, whether God exists or not, right? There's an objective fact: God exists or God does not exist. That is an objective fact. But whether we have access to that fact, it may be questionable. But you cannot say that atheism, which is the belief, generally speaking, the belief that God does not exist, or even the lack of belief, is somehow met its burden of proof. I mean, each individual person has their own burden of proof of why they hold a particular position, or why they fail to affirm or deny a particular position. It is individualized. And there's multiple different burden of proofs in any conversation. There's not just one. The notion that a burden of proof is merely on the person making the positive claim is fundamentally flawed in epistemology. There's nowhere anybody's ever read anything like that, because I've read quite a bit. I've never found anything that substantiates that. There are multiple burdens of proof that are going on in any discussion. You have your burden of proof to yourself to justify to yourself. You have your burden of persuasion, you have your burden of production. You have the other person's burden of why they failed to affirm, why they failed to deny. I mean, there's just many, many different burdens going on. There's not just one about the person making a positive assertion. That is something that has been bastardized by organizations like Atheist Experience for how long, and they refuse to actually go to a textbook and learn something about epistemology. And every epistemologist I've ever talked to that I've tried to explain to them that they are making fundamental mistakes and they're putting out misinformation, they just hand wave away and go, no, whatever. We think of it this way. We have our own terms. Okay, that's great. You can have your own terms for your group, but don't make it normative where you think that your group's terms are how they're used in academia or philosophy, because I think that's kind of intellectually dishonest. That's like a creationist saying, well, in our creationist group, we use evolution as merely change, or we use a theory as merely a guess. Dictionary definitions. Well, okay, great. In your group that you do, but I'm not a creationist, right? So I'm going to use the evolutionary terminology that I've learned in biology, right? In scope, in the domain of discourse. And I think they have a double standard there, because I think they use technical terms in science, but they default to some what's called sensu lato, or very broad definitions, which are descriptive, when they start using philosophy. And they say, well, we're going to use these terms for our group. Okay, great. Use them for your group, but don't say that everybody else has to use your crappy stipulative type, sensu lato definitions. That's the problem I have. It's not that a definition is right or wrong. It's don't force me to use your shit. That's ridiculous. I won't force you to use philosophical terms, but you have to. There's an objective fact of the matter to be that these philosophical terms do exist. And when people say, well, you're wrong about the philosophical terms, they're just objectively wrong. If they say, well, Steve's right about philosophy, we don't use that. Okay, so be it.
Yeah, I think. I think I pointed it out to you one time on Twitter. We were going on about this, and you made the argument of, well, if they want to use their own definition for this, then you have to accept it when a creationist uses theory as just a guess. And I think I responded to you with something like theory just changes the word clade to kind. That's just how they use it.
Exactly. I mean, even still, that's true. I mean, it's like, well, what's a kind? Well, it means clade. Okay, why don't you just use clade? I don't know.
Yeah, because it's kind.
Yeah, because it's kind.
Yeah. So, and you dive into a lot more philosophy than I do, so you'll be able to touch on this. I haven't. I don't. I think I have done it in the past. I try not to make it a habit to do it, and usually when I do it, I explain to them beforehand that I'm not trying to do it as a mischaracterization. It's just something that I'm using as a shorthand kind of example for some arguments here. And what do you think is the issue with comparing like a deity to things such as fairies or leprechauns or other mythical I don't want to use the word mythical creatures, I guess you could say.
I think it's a really kind of poor argument. And the reason being is this. I have people do this all the time, right? They're like, what about fairies? Well, they seem to discount what's called priors. We have understanding of fairies not existing, right? We know, like, was it the Cottingham fairies, is how you pronounce it? We know that was a hoax, right? We have understandings of ghost photography being done, which is, a hoax. We have priors that, leprechauns, when we look at a rainbow, we have an expectation based upon what we think is the properties of leprechauns, and they have a pot of gold at that. Well, there's no pot of gold, right? So there are priors for these other things, right? So we can say, look, if somebody says, like, I just merely lack a belief Santa exists, but I'm not going to say I believe Santa doesn't exist. I find that to be childish. I find it to be like, wait, you're older than 6 and you don't believe there's no Santa? Because I'm telling you right now, I believe there's no Santa. I can tell you right now, I know there is no Santa. I'll make it a knowledge claim. I don't care. I can justify that using theories of knowledge, but beside the point. But I'm not going to sit there and go, I merely lack a belief in Santa. No, Santa doesn't exist. Straight up, that's a claim. Fact. Santa doesn't exist. I will be happy to defend that. And I actually one time wrote a long thing about why Santa doesn't exist. Using well, how would he? We've seen parents buy presents for kids, right? So what's the explanation for why kids get presents? Well, we've seen parents every single time, or friends or family, or buy presents for kids. but we've never once seen Santa deliver presents, right? So there's no priors there to be had. So probabilistically speaking, which is how we base a lot of beliefs, I can safely say, yeah, I believe there's no Santa because there's evidence against it, right? There's evidence for something and there's evidence against something. We have evidence against fairies, leprechauns, and all those other metaphysical things. But God, it's such a vast topic that billions of people right around the world believe God, and it has for thousands of years. Wars have been waged over whether God exists or not, or somebody's interpretation of God. To my knowledge, nobody's ever waged war whether fairies, leprechauns, or ghosts exist, right? To my knowledge.
So if I can,
very rare.
if I can just give a little pushback from it, though, wouldn't that just be considered like an argument from antiquity and an argument from popularity?
Not necessarily, because I'm not saying that something is true because it has been argued. Right? That would be a fallacy, right? If I said God exists because of antiquity, right, then that would be a fallacy. But I'm saying it's hard to just hand wave something away when you have that many people that have a particular belief about something, right? Because if a billion people said to you, "Hey, JB, I saw a light in the sky that moved from here to there," a billion people said this, it's hard to just go, "Wait a minute here, I'm just going to discount that because it doesn't comport with my worldview," right? Now, do they all have the same explanation for things? Do they all have the same experiences? No, I'm not going to say that. But we don't see, like I said, people don't put their lives on the line for leprechauns or fairies. I think there's a huge category difference between these very basal type beliefs that most people would recognize as already been shown to be false and mythos, than a metaphysical being that exists that is somehow the universe is contingent upon. And so, I just don't put them in the same category that way.
So I guess from your standard, you would put one into a metaphysical category, whereas the other one you would put into a mythological category.
Well, metaphysical deals with existence,
okay.
Right? They're all metaphysical. But when we're talking about the origin of the universe, or the reality itself, we're talking about if there's a metaphysical necessity for that origin, and if that is, they're positing that as some type of god. They're not positing it as a leprechaun or a fairy. There's a very specific being that exists. Now, what the actual attributes are, people have a lot of different opinions upon that, but they all have one thing in common: that the universe could not exist without that being. Right? If God ceased to be, then if God exists and He ceased to be, or did not ever exist, then the universe would never exist. I think that most people that believe God exists would hold that to be the case. Would you not?
Yeah, probably.
I mean, there might be like pantheistic type thing or what's called theistic.
Yeah,
but I mean, for the most part, the universe, or some people believe the universe is God, right? But for the most part, the universe and God are intertwined such that they cannot coexist without each other.
Yeah. Now, where would you classify?
Sorry.
Now, where would you classify those people that say that the universe is God? Would you consider those as theists?
No, that's what's called a pantheism.
Right. Yeah. But I've always pantheism.
Our universe became God, right? Which is a type of pantheism, I think it was.
Yeah. What is it? Pantheism's not theism or something? It's weird.
I mean, like Spinoza's God, or the God of the philosophers, which I'm okay with, but that's not really a intentional God, right? That's not a God that has agency. So if people want to believe in a Spinoza God, that doesn't necessarily make them a theist, obviously.
Yeah. So it gets crazy when you start dealing with those terms. Yeah. I'm not sure how to do this. I'm going to try something. We're going to do this like this. Can you see that?
I can see that. Looks very familiar.
Yeah. Yeah. I did want to kind of go over this with you a little bit. I've got it over here on this other screen so I can see it a little bit larger. So what we're dealing with here is looks like you've got theism and its non-theism counterparts kind of broken down into a good little flow chart. Now several times kind of put myself in this little atheism category, which I've heard you say before that you kind of have an issue with.
Yeah,
Not necessarily for me, just the term in general.
You might want. I think you might have to blow that up a little bit. But yeah, the audio. I wanted to correct something on it, but I don't have the original form. I don't remember what I did this in, because I have hard solipsist in one place, and I probably should have put that as dosastic nihilist. I think would have been a better term for that. Because if you there are people out there that say, look, I don't have any beliefs, which is what I would label dosastic nihilism. But I think it's a very foolish position. When people say they don't have any beliefs, it's like, I don't think you understand what a belief is, because we all have beliefs. Beliefs just means that you believe a proposition is true or you believe it false. That's all it means. It's an epistemic disposition towards a proposition. That's all. I mean, they have this weird thing that I don't have beliefs. I have knowledge only. Well, you can't have knowledge without beliefs, because knowledge is a subset of belief. In every belief first condition theory, at least, like justified true belief. Yeah, Matt Dillahunty didn't like this because he's like, well, Steve started with a question here. I'm like, yeah, that's the great debate question for the last thousands of years. I don't know why you would take umbrage to that. That seemed odd. I get the weirdest criticism, man.
Yeah, I guess kind of my thing with it isn't that generally how the question works though? Does God exist, as opposed to like generally the question doesn't go, do you believe there are no gods? It's, do you believe in God?
Right. I mean, they all relate. Like the question, does God exist, is a question asking you, do you believe God exists? Right. So you're making a statement about the affairs of the universe. If I answer yes, then I'm affirming the proposition that there is a God. Right. So yes would be a theist as we understand it. If somebody says, does God exist? You say no, you're affirming the proposition of atheism that there is no God, right? So they are related. So we are asking about your beliefs, but there's a slight difference when we ask the question, do you believe there's a God? Because if you ask the question, do you believe there's a God? And you say yes, you're a theist. But if you say no, the most you can say logically about that person is that they're not a theist. And that's where the problem comes in, where people say, well, if you're not a theist, I'm just going to semantically substitute that to mean atheist. There's no logical deduction going on there. It doesn't follow logically. It's purely a semantical substitution.
Yeah, it just gets so it gets so entailed though whenever you try to dive into it deep like you did on that flow chart, because there's so many different positions to go. And I mean, I guess I can't even say that I can answer them all the same on any given day of the week. I mean, that's...
I don't have a problem with that. I don't think that's inconsistent. I think people do fluctuate, right? But I mean, I specifically separated the ontology from the epistemology, right? Because again, people conflate them all the time. And I think it's odd when they don't seem to understand when you're asking about an existential question, right? You're asking a question about ontology. Does God exist, right? That has nothing to do with asking the question, is God knowable, right? Is it knowable that God exists or not? That is a completely different proposition. So when people say, well, Gnosticism deals with knowledge, and you say, well, God exists, and I say, well, I'm agnostic on that proposition. They say, well, that deals with knowledge. They're just fundamentally wrong. I mean, there is no subjective evaluation there. They're just objectively wrong because they're not understanding. They're in the wrong domain of discourse because they don't understand the term properly. So agnosticism is the psychological position of being agnostic on the proposition such that you neither believe P is true and you neither believe P is false. You can look that up, the Stanford Encyclopedia, Dr. Draper. You can look it up in Internet Encyclopedia. I can give you 1,000 papers on that. Well, hyperbole. I give you at least a dozen, including Burgess Jackson, J.G. Smart, Michael Martin, a ton of them. So that is the understanding in philosophy. There's just no argument to be had about that because, again, I've asked for people, have one peer-reviewed paper that says anything different? Nobody's ever presented one to me. Not one. The closest they've ever come is to cite Stanford, and they misunderstand what they're reading, right? That has happened. But other than that, nobody's ever cited a paper, to my remembrance, that ever said anything different. And I think that to be very telling. I mean, if you're a science, talking about biology and evolution, don't you think you should cite paper to creationists? And you ask a creationist, can you cite me a paper that supports your position? I find nothing wrong with that, and people don't have a problem with that. But when I say, do you have a philosophical paper that cites your position? They're like, well, how do you have a philosophical paper about atheism? I'm like, well, here's a dozen, that I have citations to, right? They just don't seem to understand that. So when you're talking about the question of God existence, yes, you can be agnostic toward that question. Well, specifically toward the proposition.
I guess my kind of thing is you deal a lot with the academic part of it, and I mean I completely understand that because you try to keep things on an academic level. You do biology discussions, and when you do them, you keep them on the academical level. You don't, you do philosophy discussions, you keep them on that level. So whenever you have philosophical discussions about God, you keep them on that level. But I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong because I don't want to be wrong here. You have said in the past that you have no problem with somebody like GM Skeptic, who genetically modified skeptic, who says that he defines atheism as this way and that he does it with an agenda behind it.
Yeah, no, I think genetically modified skeptic, at least he understands it, right? I mean, a genetically modified skeptic, to my knowledge, has never once said I was wrong about my understanding of the terminology as used in academia and philosophy. Not once. He recognizes these terms. However, his argument is from a utility argument. And his utility argument is basically, yes, I'm not putting words in his mouth. Okay, I'm not trying to, but from what I can see, he would probably agree with me on all these things. But he would argue that he uses the term atheist to include the most amount of people, which is merely people that don't believe God exists, according to him, for political purposes, right? To have more of a demographic, which, by the way, stems right from Anthony Flu's paper in 1972 of the presumption of atheism. That was his argument. Is that, he even agreed. Yes, he's like, it's commonly, I don't remember the exact wording, but basically it's commonly held that atheism is the belief that God does not exist. He recognized that, but he said, I want to change it to the negative sense, merely anybody who does not believe God exists, in order to incorporate more people. It was an umbrella term that he wanted, and it was for political reasons. George Smart continued with that on a case against God. David Silverman, Fighting God. All these are political organizations that wanted to do it for political reasons, to change, policy. Because the more power you have in politics, the more people you have behind your position. Now, I think it's a self-defeating argument, though. I think that even though genetically modified skeptic does it, he's logically consistent. I mean, I don't have a problem with that as utility argument, but I think it's, in the long run, it shoots themselves in the foot, because what it does is, the whole category of nuns, they call them now, right? A lot of them don't want to be subsumed under the guise of atheism. Plus, there's some epistemic issues with it. One, it comes with a lot of baggage that I have not had to my, again, recollection, an atheist properly discuss. And there's, like, my WASP argument, the weak atheism special pleading argument. Not one atheist has ever properly addressed that. Not one. And so there's epistemic baggage to be had by having that utility argument. And so the agnostics, the theological and cognitivists, the ichtheists, they don't want to be a part of the atheist community. They don't want to be a part of that because they're not atheist. And so when you dishonestly say, look, we're going to make this term such that we're going to label you an atheist, whether you like it or not, there's going to be pushback for it. And I think it has an opposite effect, because they're not being I shouldn't say they're not being consistent. There's a consistency there, but they're not being fair to the people that they're trying to label. Because I'm fine with people labeling themselves, but you can't label somebody else, right? Because I'm not an atheist. I mean, philosophically speaking, I'm not an atheist. That's an objective fact, even though I don't have a God belief. And people have been indoctrinated by atheist experience, and Matt Dillahunty and Aaron Ra. They've been dogmatically indoctrinated to believe that if you do not have a belief in God, it is by necessity you are an atheist. That is fundamentally, categorically, 100% wrong. I mean, any epistemologist will tell them that. That is not the case. They can hold to that position, that is a necessary and sufficient condition for atheism. That's their prerogative. But they're never going to find any academic source that holds to that. And that's the problem. They never do.
Yeah, I think, and you might, I don't know how whether or not you're going to eat me up for it or not, but I generally classify myself as an atheist from the colloquial sense, from what it's used in these online communities. But basically, I explain when somebody asks me flat out, are so you believe God doesn't exist? And I say, well, I said if you want to get philosophical on it, I said then I'll put myself as an agnostic. I said I don't really care what you label me as or what the label itself is. Here's my position
Yeah, no, I
on
don't have a problem with that.
the
No,
actual
look,
discussion.
again, I don't label anybody. Matter of fact, Matt constantly makes that mistake that I tell people what they are. I never have. In fact, I have a whole page on my positions that specifically says like I will not do that. Right? You pick your label, because label is connoting certain things about your beliefs to people. Why would I tell you what your label is? You can ask me, hey, according to philosophy, what would this position be? Okay, fair enough. But if you say, look, I don't have a position either way, philosophically speaking, on the proposition, and that is called agnostic on the proposition. Okay, but if you want to choose that as atheist, that's your prerogative. But then again, it goes back to my WASP argument. Would you allow a theist to do the same thing, right? If an atheist allows for atheism to be defined in the weak case, meaning the lack of belief, it's not a matter of how much they believe. It is a matter of logic that they do not believe rather than believing the proposition is false. If an atheist allows for that and says, look, I want atheism to be defined in the negative, they have to allow theists to define theism in the negative, or else that is by definition special pleading, right? Because they have no justification not to allow theists to do the exact same thing. So a theist could, in theory, at least say, hey, look, if you don't believe there are no gods, you're a theist.
Well,
it's the same thing, and it's called mirroring. If
right.
If you're an atheist, if you don't believe God exists, and the theist says, okay, well, you're a theist if you don't believe God does not exist. Weak theism and weak atheism are logically the same position, or at least essentially, ostensibly logically the same position. They're epistemically the same for all practical purposes, right? If you're a weak atheist, you've got to be a weak theist. You can't extricate one from the other.
I'm not trying to argue. Trying to argue against it without arguing against it.
Are logically weak theist and weak atheist. I mean, think about that. It's actually the conjunction of weak atheism and weak theism.
So I guess by doing that, then you would have to also allow the theist to make the argument that if they're making the argument that as long as you don't believe, the weak theism argument mirroring there, you would also have to put apatheist and atheist and all that stuff would now be shifted to the theism category under that position, right?
Yeah, because they lack a belief, right? They're non-theist. That's why I'm saying, it's logically speaking. Okay, let's say you have there's something called the law of negation. That basically means that P or not P is T, which is a tautology, where they're always true. That is always P and not P is always a tautology. So if I have some kind of instantiation of that, where I instead of having a proposition, I have like an object, like A or not A, right? But if I put in theist for A, then theist or not theist, right?
Right. So it's everything that's not theist is.
So anything that's not theism falls in the set of not theist. What the atheist tends to do from these organizations that tell them so, because they rely on people not going to read these things, and they have for years. And when atheists started to read these things several years ago, when we started explaining to atheists this, they went, "Oh crap, we're being lied to by Atheist Experience, Atheist Republic, Atheist Alliance International." But I have a little more respect for them than most, by the way, because I think they do a good job helping people. But American atheists, especially, dishonest. But they found they were being lied to, just like they would from a religious organization, and they didn't like this. This is why I have a following, because people that actually took the time to research these things and learn about the topics said, hey, look, I can't, for some people, like, I came out of theism. I was told this by my pastor and I believed it, but, because they said it. I'm not going to make the same mistake again, but because these atheists have told me things that are just fundamentally not true. Why? Because I can read it here and see the logic. And it pissed a lot of people off. And that's why I got a backlash, because they're like, well, why is Steve telling people this? This is helping theists because, he's telling atheists the truth. I'm like, look, the truth should never be scared of. I'm not helping theists. If anything, I'm helping atheists become better critical thinkers. That's all. I don't know why that's such backlash for that.
So basically, you're saying that that sitting on the fence is comfortable, so you enjoy sitting on the fence. Huh?
It's difficult. it's funny because a lot of a weak atheist, a lot of people who merely hold that not believing God is atheism, and they say, look, I'm not saying there are no gods, I just merely lack a belief. Okay, they're fence sitters. They are fence sitters. They don't seem to understand. They don't get this, and then they tell me I'm wrong about it, and it's like, oh my God. Okay, look, this is a dichotomy. You believe or you don't believe. And I love when like Matt Dillahunty throws that out all the time, like it's some kind of defeater. Yes, we all agree, Matt, that you believe or you don't believe. I don't know anybody who doesn't think that's a dichotomy, right? Clearly, it's one or the other. It's called a principle bivalence. That's not that is a what's called a lici ignoranto. It's basically a trivially true thing that we all agree upon. Who gives a shit? That's not where agnosticism lies. Nobody's ever argued that agnosticism exists between belief and not belief. It lies between belief the proposition is true and belief the proposition is false. That's a completely different situation, which is not dichotomous. And people that have studied logic go, yeah, okay, that's true. And so when you have these people saying, well, there's no place for agnosticism between, theism and atheism, they're making the presupposition that atheism is merely a lack of belief rather than the philosophical understanding that it's the belief that the proposition is not true. So they're by fiat just moving the entire category. It's assuming agnosticism under atheism. And I think that's, again, intellectually dishonest because a theist can do the exact same thing. And I make that point in my essay, Gumballs and God. I mean, which, by the way, to my knowledge, again, has not been refuted and has been reviewed by Landon Curtin, who, by the way, is a pretty famous world mathematician who understands logic pretty well. And he reviewed it and he thought it was a spot on essay. So, and he's actually, I'm sure, talked to a lot of the atheists and said, yeah, if you're going to show that his essay is wrong, you need to provide facts to Steve, because I love his quote. He said, if you come at Steve about facts, you're only going to piss Steve off and be wrong. Is basically what he said. If you don't, because you argue Steve with facts. Like, I tend to be factual, right? I try to.
Pissing Steve off is the fun thing to do online, though, isn't it?
I guess so. It's like, it's so funny too. And I'll be honest with you, man. I again, on Twitter, 99% of the time, I have no emotional connection to anything that I write on Twitter. It's just, it comes across that way because it's very succinct, right? It's very curt in how you put something in 280 characters. And even when I put something in capital letters, it's for emphasis. Or when I usually put an asterisk, or if I capitalize, it's not because I'm angry, right? People are like, oh, you're shouting. It's like, oh, come on. I don't give a shit about this. I don't have any emotional investment in my comment to you. Have I ever made angry comments on Twitter? Yeah, of course. Who hasn't? But it's very rare. It's usually dealing with a friend. If somebody's saying something about a friend of mine, then yes, that is actual anger, and I do get upset. But when people like talk to me one on one, I don't get angry. I usually get annoyed. It's like you're just wasting my time,
Yeah, I do the same thing a lot of times. When I do the opposite, though. You deal with them when they come to you. I jump in random conversations and throw something out and then just walk away. It's like, y'all can just y'all can have fun with that one for a little bit.
Like here's a blog for you, and sometimes they'll tag me and sometimes they don't. I'm like, oh, look, I'm being cited. Yay. My blog, I gotta admit, is a pretty decent reference for an atheist. If they want to go check it out, because it gives them the primer on some of these concepts.
I can't remember exactly how it came up, but I brought up one of your philosophical, I guess you could say, articles. I haven't even read it, but I remember you talking about it one time, and I was having a discussion with a Christian, and he came up and got into a quick discussion about philosophy, and he was talking about logical contradictions and stuff, and he brought up a married bachelor, and I was like, Steve McRae actually has said that he wrote a thing on how he can do a married bachelor without a logical contradiction in it.
Well, no, it is a contradiction, but it uses what's called paraconsistent logic.
Okay, so you just use it.
Yeah, it doesn't use classical logic. It uses a different form of logic that allows for what's called true contradictions without the principle of explosion. And I told you I had my article is basically just rephrasing and explaining the argument that's on Stanford Encyclopedia, right? It's not my own argument. I never claimed it to be my own argument, and I cite SEP. But yes, you can have an example of a married bachelor if you don't use classical logic. If you use other forms of logic, there's multiple different types of logic. I mean, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of types of logic, right? You have classical logic, you have propositional logic, you have predicate logic, you have epistemic logic, you have dosastic logic, you have paraconsistent logic, you have dotheistic logic, you have intuitionist logic. There's a lot of different type of logics. Not one size fits all. So using different forms of logic, you have modal logic, and even then you have multiple actions in modal logic. So yeah, you can have an example of a Mary Bachelor if you use some other type of logic. Yes.
Yeah, classical logic is all there is, Steve.
Classical logic is all there is. I've had people deny classical logic. Look, if you're going to deny paraconsistent logic, okay, fine. If you're going to deny intuitionist logic, whatever.
As a matter of fact,
but you cannot deny classical logic and say you're a rational thinker. I'm sorry, that's not compatible to me.
You have to give me an argument using classical logic that classical logic isn't all that there is in order for me to accept something else.
The precept. Well, these things are axioms, right? I mean, when you start dealing with classical logic, you're basically dealing with a set of axioms. And from those axioms, you can develop an objective framework. But when people deny certain things like law of identity, like X equals X, I don't know where you go with that. I mean, how would you deny something so fundamental as an axiom? Now, yes, you do assume them as a precept, right? I mean, we have to assume the law of identity is true. There's no way to prove an axiom. They're taken unproven. Matter of fact, axioms are unprovable, or most axioms are unprovable. In this particular case, law of identity is unprovable, but it is the foundation by which we make other proofs, logical proofs. There's multiple, obviously, axioms that go into proofs, Peano's axioms and other axioms. But in order to have a logical proof or a mathematical proof, you have to base it upon axioms which are not provable.
All right. So we've been going for just over an hour, so we're going to see if we
really already.
Yeah, it's been an hour, 1 hour, 1 minute. So there's some questions from some people in the audience here. Would you agree that a being that exists that only created the universe would not be the being that most religions describe? I think we kind of covered that earlier.
I think most religions kind of do. I mean, in some way, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly, most world religions, as far as any kind of Judeo-Christianic type God, is the prime mover God, right? Is the uncaused cause, is the first cause. That would be something that is a metaphysical necessity. Now, they don't explicitly say that a lot of times because they don't know what a metaphysical necessity is, but in practicality, they're saying that there's a being that exists that created the universe, that without him, the universe would have never existed or could not exist. I think that's kind of ubiquitous on most of the major world religions to some degree.
Well, they're saying it's a being that only created the universe. So it's created the universe and done nothing else. So
okay. Well, yeah, no, I think that would personalized type deity, right? A God,
that would
revelation and things of that nature. But again, under the non-classical schema, a deity that created the universe and then walked away, or if in a pantheistic type thing, or pandeism became the universe, that still would be, to me, fall under some kind of supernatural being to explain a metaphysical necessity of why the universe exists. And I'm okay with people using different uses of terms as long as I understand what they're meaning, right? If they say, look, I'm a theist, but I mean theist as in a personalized type God, and a person who believes in a deist would not be theism to me. Okay, I understand that. I have a friend, Dr. Kenny Rhodes. He believes that, right? He's a classical theist. So to him, a deist would not be a theist. Okay, he's not wrong on that because he's dealing with the schema of classical theism. But he also understands my schema of non-classical theism, and he would agree. In my schema, deism would be under theism. So there's no right or wrong answer. It's just what framework are you working with? That's why you got to be real careful in terminology and talking to somebody. But this is why I could talk to somebody like Dr. Rhodes and understand what he's talking about from his perspective, and he can understand what I'm talking about from my perspective. Amazing how that works, right?
That's why I hate philosophy.
No, you do not. Dude, it's so funny because philosophy is reason, right? It's complicated, but for the most part, it's just reason.
I'll tell you what I usually summarize this like this, and this is, I hate people that try to weaponize philosophy. It's I hate philosophy itself. It's
they use it as a cudgel. Yeah.
Like Jordan Peterson, like a lot of people say what he says is word salad. Well, it's not all word salad. A lot of it has meaning behind it. But the point is he can say it in a way that he's in a way different than what he's saying it. He's saying it that way to add a certain intelligence, like
No, I know.
language to it. Is how I feel about it. You know?
Yeah, no, I understand the Peterson approach. No, he is a trained person in these fields. But people say that like I'll use philosophy as a weapon, and maybe there's a little bit to be said for that, but it's not as in any kind of malicious way. I mean, facts are facts, right? And I don't like weaponizing that. It's not a matter of weaponizing facts. I think people that when they say they weaponize philosophy, they use philosophy in a manipulative type way, like Darth Dawkins or those presuppers. You weaponize philosophy. A lot of them get a lot of it right, but the mistakes they make or the rhetoric they have, the sophistry that they have, I find to be disconcerting, right? I don't use sophistry. Do I have an appreciation for it? Yes. I think there's a time and place for sophistry. I have no problem with decent sophistry. But when you use sophistry as a weapon, that's not the point of sophistry. Sophistry is to help educate people by using, fallacious type arguments.
Yeah, I think another example though that I couldn't stand was on Modern Day Debate one day. Scholar Fiction was on there with Dr. Trent Doherty. And they were doing a problem of evil discussion. And Skylar was like putting out, this is this and this and this. And the whole time it's not a syllogism. I can't respond to you. And it's like, really, dude? You understand what he's saying without it being in a syllogism.
Trent Doherty was saying that? I've listened to Trent before.
Yeah. He was pissed at Skylar that day because.
Well, I think there might have been more to it. I think I do remember what you're talking about. I think
it was
that story because.
There was a lot to it.
I think because Skylar doesn't often have well-formed arguments.
So it was, and I'm just like, dude, you understand what he's saying.
You didn't give any principle clarity of what you're saying.
Take the time and work through it. You know what I mean? Don't just.
I get that, but a lot of people get tiresome. I mean, I understand the reasoning sometimes where people are like, look, your argument's so bad that I need you to put it in a more, like, for example, like I'll give you an example. When people bring up the term agnostic atheist, it's so ambiguous. And I ask a very simple question, and I've never, to this day, again, to my recollection, had anybody do this or answer it, at least effectively. But I'll ask them, look, I am not sure what you mean by this term, right? It's too ambiguous. It's too logically ambiguous for certain. Can you tell me in logical notation, which is quite unambiguous, what you mean by agnostic atheist? Like, for example, if you're a theist, you can put that logical notation as BP, believes the proposition God exists, right? You would agree with that, right?
Yeah.
Forget the atheist stuff as far as logical notation of atheism. But if philosophically speaking, atheism would believes not P, right? B, not P. But there's no ambiguity in these terms. If I say BP, I can say, okay, logically that is, when you put it back in grammatical syntax, believes the proposition. So a theist is somebody who believes the proposition God exists. Okay, great. I understand that, unambiguated. But when I ask people, can you put agnostic atheism in logical notation for me? They fail every single time. And it's just like, look, I'm trying to explain to you that this term is ambiguous, and your inability to put it in a logical form seems to indicate that I'm correct on it, the fact that it's ambiguous. I think I may have one or two people try, but again, they kind of like fumbled with it. But very rarely does anybody even try to put that in the logical notation. So I have to ask, why is that? Why is it that you cannot find a person who says I'm agnostic atheist that is willing to put that in logical notation? They'll just give me pushback on that and say, oh, well, you're just being this or that, whatever. And they're personalized attacks. I'm like, well, no, I'm just trying to unambiguate it. That's all.
Yeah. Somebody else is real good about that.
Put it in logical notation. Can anybody in the audience put a logical notation? And by the way, I have a page putting agnostic atheism in logical notation. I have a whole blog entry on it, and it's more than just one thing. I could put it in. I think I put 12 different types of notations it could possibly be.
Copy and paste. Now, another person that's real good about that kind of stuff is like I've come to like is Ask Yourself, because he will go through the argument with you step by step and say, okay, is this premise? And you can hear him actually like typing it out like while he's talking to him. He's like,
he's put on my channel.
Okay, that doesn't follow.
He does a really good review of stuff. He made a video on T-Jump's greatest hits. It was just just
him and T-Jump are actually a really good discussion. I thought that because I've seen them not really get along like away from each other, that them actually
to show T-Jump's misunderstandings, I guess you could say.
Them actually together was a really good. They had a I think it was like an hour-long debate on modern day debate, and both of them came to the question from the question of the debate. Both of them had different understandings of what the question was, and then they got to the end and asked yourself, like, explained it to T-Jump. T-Jump's like, no, that's stupid. I would never agree to it if that's what I thought it was. And he was like, nobody thinks that. And it was great because like he's like typing it out. And he's like, well, that doesn't answer this. And T-Jump's like, yeah, no shit. I'm not trying to answer that.
That's hilarious. Yeah, that sounds like kind of how their most of their conversations go.
Yeah, but I mean, they're actually like, you see people like they kind of like do videos of. I know Ask Yourself has done videos on T-Jump. I haven't seen T-Jump do one on him, but I first saw it. I was like, these two are finally going to get to talk to each other, and it's going to be like fireworks. And then they get in there, and it's just like as calm as can be, and like they're like friends and laughing the whole time while they're doing it. And I'm like, wow, that's a completely different way than you kind of figured it was going from headed into it. You know?
Well, I mean, but I remember one time there was a video. T-Jump for some reason said, he's like an expert in logic, right? And again, I don't claim to be an expert, but I think if you claim to have an expertise, you probably should have a decent, understanding of the basics. And I remember Ask Yourself had asked him, I think it was what was a biconditional or something. And T-Jump had no idea what a biconditional is, which is basically, P if and only Q. So basically P and Q have to be true for the truth table to be true. And he had no idea what a biconditional was. So I don't think he understands what a biconditional is, an implication, converse, contradiction. These are terms that I don't think he understands logically. And yet I think when you claim to be an expert in a particular topic, especially logic, you probably should be able to understand what something like a conditional implication is or biconditional statement is. I don't think it's too much to ask for that. And it kind of shut T-Jump down because, I mean, he literally has said that he has an expertise in logic. And T-Jump's like, no, you don't.
I do have to go in a couple minutes, but somebody in the comments did say something I wanted to point out to you. They said that classical logic is wrong because it starts with ifs.
It's so funny because I know what they're referring to. And I'm not even making this up.
Yeah, I saw it yesterday morning. I responded to you last night. You did a new flowchart thing, and I was like, you used if, so you're wrong.
I had a guy in a group, and this is a private group. This is why I can't share a screenshot, but it was because I don't do that, generally speaking. So I had a guy who said, this guy claims to be a high school dropout, doesn't know what modus ponens is, doesn't know what logic is, but he claimed your argument failed basically at the beginning because it starts with the word if. And I'm like, oh, God. I was like, oh, the pain. That's just the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. And the second time that's the second I think atheist has told me your argument fails because it begins with if, and I'm like, oh God.
So William Craig is wrong because all his start with if.
Additional implication. I mean, I've never in my life could I imagine somebody being that bad at a topic, but nope, it happens.
All of William Craig's arguments start with if. So I guess we can just throw all his arguments out now. So that'll work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know who said it. I was just saying that.
Oh, it's hilarious.
Pheasant wanted you to know that it was him that made that comment. All right. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody that joined. This little small crowd for Steve McRae show. So,
it's not the size, man.
Keep telling yourself that.
I look, one viewer or 1,000 viewers, I've had both. It's all about the discussion with me, man. You know that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still growing. It's still, it's whatever. I don't do these every week. I don't do these all the time. I think this is the first one I've had in about a month. So just whenever I get a chance, try to schedule something out.
I appreciate it. Like I said, always flattered to be invited. I love having discussions, and
I mean,
love helping channels out. I do. I always have.
Let's be real about this, Steve. You invited yourself on Twitter. I
This
was
is
putting
true.
out.
No, he's not even funny. I was like, wait, when am I coming on? Because you're like, oh, I have this person. I'm like, well, what about me? Yes, you're right. I did.
Steve kind of jumped in and was like, "I'm such and such, Steve," and I was like, yeah. And then we had to move it for something I can't remember. But
yeah, I think last time I wasn't feeling well or something.
yeah, so I mean, it was fun. I mean, just having to get it rescheduled. I do have some things planned that I'm trying to get done. I do hopefully have some big names coming on. Trying to draw some people in. I'm got some emails I got to send out to bring some people in. Trying to get Dr. Josh Bowen on, but I want to discuss something other than slavery. I think that one's kind of unique.
He knows a lot about stuff. He's talking about multiple different stuff.
But so I want to thank everybody for stopping by and checking out the show today, and to everybody who watches this in the future, thank y'all for clicking on it. And I don't have the next one scheduled, so I'll let you know when I do. But have a good one.
All right, guys.